thrilled to be here today with all of you on National Girls and Women's in Sports Day. So it's a big day in our industry, and I couldn't be more privileged to be joined by my adopted school of UCLA head coach Cori Close, who's been with the program for quite a long time, and we're going to get into it in a bit, as well as star player Kiki Rice, who is going to be sharing her NIL journey with us. But before we get into that, I'd really love, I think I need a clicker. Yeah, there we go. It's the end of the day, and I'm on East Coast time. So before we get into that, I wanted to share a little bit about the founding of Deep Blue Sports and Entertainment. And so much of what we're seeing, I know this conference is called Building for Sustained Growth, but truly the women's sports industry at this moment in time, this should be called Building for Explosive Growth. Equal pay! Equal pay! Equal pay! Equal pay! Equal pay! How many of you remember that in 2019? Yeah, when the U.S. women's national team had just sued their employer for equal pay, a lawsuit which they won. And ultimately, at that moment in time, when they had won the World Cup in France in 2019, there was, this incredible moment where you would have expected the crowd to be chanting USA, and instead they were chanting equal pay. And the conversation at that time across the punditry, commentary, social media was like, this time it's going to be different. This time there's sustained momentum. Something is in the water. Things are changing. But the reality of it was, in as much as the mass consumer market felt that, there's an entire infrastructure and system that sits within the sports industry at large, one which our industry contributes greatly to. And if you had gone on the NWSL website, which is our domestic women's professional soccer league here in the United States, the day that the U.S. women held up that World Cup trophy in 2019, if you scroll to the very bottom of that website, which is what I did, you would have found that there were 4 brand partners for the league. An apparel company who was responsible for the kits, Lifetime, the women's cable network, which was the distribution media partner at the time, as well as a supplements company, and I always say maybe somebody's relative's lawn care business because there was no website for the 4th. And I remember thinking it's a true story, I remember thinking at that moment in time that ultimately there's a systemic issue here. If these partners don't evolve and the investment doesn't grow, this conversation of this time it's going to be different may actually be a moot point. And so for the last 4+ years have been on a journey really uncovering at the root of some of the key components that need to evolve and change in order for the women's sports industry to not only survive, but ultimately thrive. And if you really dig into it, the media ecosystem has not set up the women's sports industry for success. And what I mean by that is the currencies, as well as the metrics, are not synonymous with where this market is at its current life cycle, or life stage rather. If you look at, and I'll give you a great scenario, a media company holding company media buyer who's sitting within, the space of being responsible for planning tens to hundreds of millions of dollars annually, and by and large tasked with reach and efficiencies as the lowest common denominator for what they're working towards. I could tell you what doesn't deliver on reach and efficiencies: women's sports. They don't necessarily have scale at this moment in time, as attributed to a lag in media rights deal and primetime visibility and coverage. They're not necessarily built to be as visible all the time in streaming environments. And with respect to social media, the athletes are the ones that are really at the forefront of tipping that scale. So if you're a buyer and you have $1 to spend and your options are Sunday Night Football versus the WNBA playoffs, I could tell you where that dollar goes because you don't have to justify that decision, or at least it is an easier choice. And that dollar goes to Sunday Night Football. So we really started digging into it, and we said, ultimately, women's sports doesn't have a consumer demand challenge. I'm sure you all are seeing the headlines where on a regular basis, our friends at UCLA included, the women's sports industry is breaking ratings records as well as attendance records seemingly on a regular basis, if not daily at this moment in time. There's so many signals that are pointed to in the press at this moment that really indicate what that looks like. So skyrocketing valuations. We just saw an incredible increase in the NWSL's deal, as well as team valuations across that league, for example. Attendance records, as I alluded to, nearly 100,000 people at a University of Nebraska volleyball game just this year, a women's volleyball game. Looking at, we're going to talk about the rise of these media deals and ultimately how that's impacting things being much more robust within the space. We saw yesterday in the press the aggregation of a few of the big ones and ultimately what that's going to mean for women's sports. And then what we're going to talk about today is really this new economy that is NIL and how that's impacting women's sports as well. I think I'm going the wrong way. And ultimately what that leads to, and we've seen the stat now quite a bit, that Deloitte is projecting for the first time ever, women's sports is set to surpass $1 billion in revenue in 2024. That number looks significant, but I can tell you on the men's side, it's well near 500 billion. So we've got quite a bit of runway to make up. To throw some more stats here, advertising and media investment and media coverage are still lagging behind greatly. Just 9% of brands are spending within the women's sports space, indicating, though, that 83%, while they're looking to increase that spend, ultimately at the end of the day, or their sports budget rather, looking to increase 1% to 2%. It's our initiative to really help them move a little bit more. And then ultimately, when you look at visibility and coverage, just 15% of media coverage goes to the women's sports industry. I don't know about you, but if you're going into your boss to have a conversation about moving dollars, I'm not so sure that 15% coverage is going to tip the scale. So we've identified, what these issues are and ultimately where we think we need to move. So again, the current structure is not really indicative of how we should be buying and selling. There's a currency issue. How we measure, really thinking about scale and reach. Women's sports is a brand play focused on lifetime value. 2 to 3x women's sports fans, 2 to 3x that of general sports fans with respect to everything from brand affinity to favorability, intent to purchase, et cetera, and so forth. So we need to look at a hard look at what the metrics are in evaluating this. What we say, there's totally lack of contextual relevance. The storytelling has largely been a rinse and repeat model of what we know from men's. But that said, we haven't had the visibility and coverage to really unpack and provide contextualization to that. So we need to challenge that and what that looks like. And then ultimately, as we move forward, where we can find it. The discoverability, there's a great sort of joke within the women's sports industry that women's sports fans are by and large the most digitally savvy because you have to go behind 5 paywalls to find a regular season game. So helpful if you're in the tech business, but ultimately all of that, and I think this is really our why. So we know the infrastructure needs a rewrite. We know how we're measuring and buying ultimately needs an overhaul. But as I was saying earlier, that 15% number, as we were building the business plan for Deep Blue, it wasn't the thing that convinced me we were going to make inroads on with the business community. By and large, walking into boardrooms, not just marketing conversations. And then we came upon this. 45% of girls will drop out of sports by the age of 14 years old as a result of body confidence issues as well as a myriad of other reasons, which was recently reported by Dove and Nike. To go a step further, 90% of women in the C-suite have played sports at some point in their lives. And over 50% of that number have played like Kiki Rice at the highest levels collegiately. Connect those dots. How much societal and economic impact has been lost and is still yet to gain as a result of making sure there is visibility and access in the women's sports space? We're talking about lifelong skills that are acquired as a result of participating in sport that have social and economic returns. That's why we're in this business. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our amazing guests and just have a chat about the work that they're doing to really transform what's happening at UCLA women's basketball. Coach Cori, so great to have you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Kiki Rice.
Hi, everyone.
Coach Cori, you've been with the UCLA program now for how many years?
13 years.
13 years. You've seen an incredible growth trajectory happening in women's sports, coupled with the fact that we are now in the era of NIL, which means your job has diversified and multiplied, I'm sure, times 10. Can you walk us through the state of women's college basketball and sports at large and what you're learning in this very real building the plane while flying it phase of college sports?
Yeah, multiplying more than diversifying at this point. But yeah, I think the biggest thing right now, and it's really wrapped up in something that just was published recently. When I don't know if you remember when we were in the bubble and we had to play the NCAA tournament in these situations, and all of a sudden a tweet went out from Sedona Prince about the differences of gender equity from the men's basketball NCAA tournament to the women's basketball NCAA tournament. And through that exposure, where sort of the NCAA was blown up in terms of their gender equity policies just for March Madness and the NCAA tournament, one of the things that they were asked to do was to evaluate the worth of the women's basketball tournament from a media rights perspective. And at that time, it was being valued at about $8 million a year. And an outside company, Adesser Media, actually evaluated at that same time that it was actually worth between 80 and 110 million per year, and that was being left on the table. We just signed a new deal with ESPN and ABC, and that's worth 68 million a year. So not quite where we wanted it to go, but but huge in terms of the multiples. And so you're talking about, exposure, attendance, all of the things that Laura already mentioned, but it is a brand new age, and it's no longer, it used to be, I was begging because of the cause side of this, how impactful it is culturally for girls and women to be involved in sport, which you saw by some of the statistics. But that still is a really valuable and worthwhile investment. But now it is about a business decision. It is a really good business decision. And if you're smart, you get into the buying now. It's a lot less expensive now than it's going to be in 5-10 years and down the road. But it's a totally new era, and I'm thrilled to be a part of sort of a tipping point time.
I love that. And thinking about tipping point, Kiki Rice, you're of a generation that is one of the first really, to enter into the NIL market, which we really believe is indicative of the fact that, the women's sports, we're done with the charity checks. This is what we are positioning as a growth market, one that is ripe with business opportunity. And for those of you who don't know, Kiki Rice was the Jordan brand's first ever NIL athlete signing. Male or female, just first. Kiki, take us through that process. And for those in attendance today, what are the sort of things that maybe we don't know about what we're reading in NIL, but as you're working with brand partners and how you're creating content and things that you're thinking about with respect to, what aligns with your brand and your values that you can educate us on?
Yeah, NIL is a great opportunity for all of us college athletes because it really gives us an opportunity to demonstrate to our followers, the viewers of our sport, of the game, our interest beyond the court as well. So everyone knows we're basketball players, but NIL and partnering with all these different brands allows us to kind of develop our entire brand and really show people, okay, who is Kiki Rice off the basketball court? So I think that's definitely one of my favorite parts about NIL, and just being able to explore all the different opportunities and brands off the court. And one thing I also love about NIL is just that it gives athletes kind of an opportunity to put our feet in the business world. I think not only are we able to make money off of these deals, but we're also able to get valuable kind of work and practical experience, which is something as a college athlete that you can miss out on because of practices, traveling, there's your team commitments. There's also an area where I can be okay, I can get an internship out of this deal, or I can learn what it's like to work or be in this field. So that's another really important part of NIL.
What do you look for in brand partners between you and your peers? Are there conversations or filters or things that are really important to you in deciding who you're going to align with beyond just the financial components?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is figuring out what brands authentically match me and my interests, and kind of a lot of times I look at, okay, who has this brand partnered with before me? Are they people that I want to be aligned with? Are they groups that I want to be aligned with? Do they share some of the same interests and values? And I'll really focus on something that feels like an authentic partnership. Obviously, you want to look at you recognize your value. I recognize my value as an athlete, so I'm not going to do something with a brand that doesn't recognize that value, but I also want to be really particular about making sure that I'm aligning myself with a brand that stands for what I stand for as well.
Very important. Coach Cori, you were talking about the increase in media rights valuation recently as a result right now of still bundling, but in the future, there are reports that when it'll be unbundled, some questions that will women's basketball actually be valued at a higher multiple than men's? The question I want to get into you with is last year's final matchup, 9.9 million viewers, trumped that of the men's final NCAA tournament game. What many people leave out is the ... That 9.9 million was on a Sunday at 3 p.m. East Coast time. That game wasn't prime time.
No.
What are the misnomers happening in the marketplace and in a room filled with people within and adjacent to the advertising media marketing business that you would want this audience to take away and share with their colleagues and friends about how, we may think that things are exploding because we're reading these big headlines, but ultimately at the end of the day, there's still work to be done.
Well, there's work to be done, but there's also even more than's being reported. So engagement, what they talked about, the social media engagement from that weekend, and so many people, and you guys know way more about this than I do, but in terms of, followers versus engagement and real commitment. Remember how you talked about, women were the most tech savvy because we've had to search for women's sports? Well, honestly, that also leads to such a high level of commitment engagement. And so if you're a media buyer, if you're a brand, you want people that are really tuning in, not just scrolling through. These are committed, invested people in the fans of women's basketball. So I think it's just huge. And I'll just tell you a quick story, actually, about a brand from Kiki's background. And we have a whole network of engagement. We've had a goal in our UCLA women's basketball to be top 5 in engagement across the entire social media space, for all of women's basketball. And so we've been working with a lot of intentionality of how to create that. And one of the things we've done is we've developed an influencer team that really believes in the cause of what we're doing and how we're building our program. And so they say, hey.
You haven't asked me to join that yet. I'm just doing it organically.
You got to step your game up. No, I'm just teasing. But the reality is of that influencer group, there's over 82 million followers and a really high level of engagement. And so Kiki's agent called me up and said, we have this brand. They're only having 5 women's basketball players from different schools across the country. And, Kiki is not at the same level as these other 4 athletes right now. So can you engage your influencer team? I said, absolutely. We got everybody together. We talked about what was going to be coming out, and they had an individual launch as well as a collective launch. And 24 hours later, I get this call from her agent. She's like, you are not going to believe it. She's like, they are so pleased Kiki blew the other 4 out of the water. And her engagement, the following, the reach, all of those things, because there was just such an intentional and committed effort. And so I just think that we're scratching the surface. If you're a brand that the ratings and those things tell part of the story, but it doesn't tell all of the story, I think the depth of engagement is where you're getting that next step of buying power. We had a situation, we worked with a brand just recently. They did the same deal with the men and the same deal with the women. And it was not even close. And, they had way more followers. Our men's basketball team had way more sort of on the surface eyeballs. But the transition to buying for that brand, it was, I think, 10 times. And so what it was garnered from the women's side. So I think that's sort of some of the examples of what you're looking at.
The metrics have to change around women's sports and how we're evaluating opportunities. Last April, we hosted the Business of Women's Sports Summit in New York, which I was fortunate enough to have Kiki there for, and Alexis Ohanian, who's an investor here in Angel City and started the Los Angeles Golf Club. We were having a conversation on stage about there's a predisposition that women inherently making more content than men. And of the next generation, the one that Kiki is a part of, we were talking a lot about how there may be a tipping point that was verified by a number of conversations following the summit of where, because women are making more TikToks and Instagram posts and YouTube videos, et cetera, and so forth, that the next generation of fan, one that is more in tune with highlights and social following than they are broadcast time and full game engagement, we're going to see this transition where the next generation is going to be following these athletes, where they're now going to know Kiki Rice before they may know Kiki's, I'll throw this out into the University W team, right? And so are we at this tipping point? And so Kiki, I'd love your thoughts on that. And what you're seeing with respect to the content you're putting out, as well as some of your peers, and these engagement conversations and the feedback that you get from your followers.
Yeah, and I'm going to tell your agent whatever you say because they're trying to get her to post more for that reason.
No, it is really interesting because I would say all of my teammates on my UCLA team, if you compare that, like their social medias and our just presence on all the social media platforms, is definitely we're just a lot more invested and a lot more in tune to the content we're creating and putting out there. So it is really interesting because all my friends on the men's team, they might have some more followers than some of my teammates on my team, but their content, how much they're putting into their social media, the response from their followers is not nearly the same as my teammates, even though the men, they have a lot more followers. So I think the investment that a lot of us put in our social media and what we're putting out there in the content from our followers is a lot more significant on our end than our male counterparts.
And they're less statistical oriented. It's more storytelling, which, I think is a really big piece. I think women, this is a stereotype, but are more in tune to telling the story and aligning with a cause. And we all know the research of the generations that they want to be aligned with people that have a cause, that it can't just be you score a lot of points and get a lot of rebounds, and so I think that's another piece.
Talking about intentionality, I know we're just at time, but Kiki was kind enough to bring something here to do a little bit of show and tell.
Yeah.
So in addition to being Jordan's first NIL athlete, she also is the first athlete to have a personal edition shoe, which she just got a chance to have a first look at. And she was kind enough to bring it here. But Kiki, I'd love for you to share the shoe, but more importantly, the backstory and the intentionality and story that went into the development.
Yeah. So here's the shoe, everyone. Thank you. So this is a PE personal edition, and basically every so often Jordan will select some of their athletes to have a PE, and I was fortunate enough to be the first NIL athlete and first college athlete with a PE, and so we kind of get to design it and kind of put our personal touch on it. And so I'm from Washington, D.C., and cherry blossoms are a big thing every spring in D.C., in the D.C. area. So the theme of it is cherry blossoms. It's kind of hard to see some of the details from here, but the inside of the sole, it's like there's flowers, kind of cherry blossoms in there. And then a lot of
We could clap.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
some small details on the tongue of a cherry blossom and the colors, and it's just something that was really important and a big moment for me when I first got to see them, because it's like, wow, it's my own shoe that I'm wearing out there on the court, so it's very cool.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone, I think as you have heard and can see here today, while we know that, and I cut this off earlier because we had to get to the conversation. Ultimately, what we believe and have been out in the market really driving a narrative around is that, women's sports aren't just having a moment. This is the moment. And as we've shared with you, we believe $1 billion bet, and hopefully more. So thank you all for joining us. Make sure you get out to see this UCLA women's basketball Bruins team. I'm sure Coach Cori can put together some tickets.
Free tickets for anyone who wants to come.
And make sure you get the pre-order on the cherry blossoms. Thank you, 4A's, for having us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.